you must be empathic with the writing process. And this holds true if you're a director, a cinematographer, an editor. Everyone is a storyteller, and we've got to recognize this and work together. There are no territorial prerogatives. Categorically against the possessive credit unless the director has earned it by a brilliant series of films. And in fact, I teach at the American Film Institute, and we have a program which is called Feature Film and Television Writing for Directors and Producers. We teach them to write just so they can better convey their ideas, not to convert them into writers, but to understand what writers do and be respectful of the process, or empathic, as I said earlier. After Get Smart, once you have a hit show on the air, you have creative freedom, even in an austere demographic-run society. And I did a number of shows of which I was very proud, He and She being a prime favorite, because I was able to enter the world of romance and do a show where people liked each other. It's very easy to do comedy where you denigrate each other. It's much harder to do one where it's affection and caring. And that was a very significant challenge to me. And probably my second best collection of reviews were for He and She. And of course, Paula Prentice and Dick Benjamin were the ideal couple. And Jack Cassidy and Hamilton Camp and Kenny Mars were supporting players who were brilliant, and each brought a highly unique style of delivery and interpretation to their role. I was told by CBS if I could get Paula Prentice for a series, I had a commitment. And by great good fortune, I didn't know Paula, I didn't know how to approach her. I played in a card game, and there was a stranger in our card game. And when we got to talk, I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I'm a personal manager." And I said, "No, who do you represent?" And among them was Paula Prentice. So I felt fate had entered the card game. And I met with Paula, and I told her the idea, and she said, "I love it, but and I'm willing to do it, but I want to work with my husband." And I said, "Who is your husband?" And she said, "Dick Benjamin." Well, at that time, Dick was totally unknown. He only played in road companies of Neil Simon plays. Fortunately, my wife Gloria had been in Chicago and had seen a production of Barefoot in the Park, and had called me and said, "There's an actor in this, is your type of actor. His name is Dick Benjamin. If you ever get a chance to use him, you should." So the name meant something to me. So I said yes, trusting Gloria's judgment completely. Said, "Paul, that's all right with me. I'll clear it with the network." And I called Mike Dan, and I said, "I've got Paula Prentice." He said, "Well, you've got the commitment." I said, "Wait a minute, there's a kicker. She wants to work with her husband." He said, "That's okay, make the deal." Well, I did, and I felt, well, this is the way it should be. About 7 or 8 weeks later, wherever I went, there was a message to call Mike Dan. I finally got hold of him in New York, and he said, "Leonard, did you make that deal with Paula Prentice and her husband?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Is her husband an actor?" He had no idea what he did, but he had gone along on faith, and then he suddenly had to explain it. It could have been a personal manager or a technician. Ethel Winan, who was the casting director for CBS, and had been part of the history of the industry, and had worked with John Houseman, and she's remarkable. Always complained when we had lunch that casting directors were never truly appreciated, never respected. You simply didn't take their word about talent. And well, she was casting He and She, and she called me up and said, "Leonard, I have the perfect actor for the fireman. You couldn't do any better." And I said, "What's his name?" And she said, "Ken Mars. And I'll send him over." I said, "Yes, send him over and tell me he has the part." She said, "What?" I said, "Tell me he has the part." She said, "What do you mean?" I said, well, you just said I can't do any better. He's the perfect actor. I'm trusting your judgment. Send him over and tell him he has the part. She said, well, I'll send him and one other. He and she had a working wife, but so did Dickens and FENSTER. Dickens and FENSTER had Kate, Harry Dickens' wife, was a nurse who went to work. We didn't even think of pioneering. It seemed logical to me. And Paula worked in the welfare. She donated her time. She was doing something constructive for mankind. So we tried to subtext, set examples without preachment. A Rock by Any Other Name was written by Alan Burns and Chris Hayward, who were one of the writing teams we had in the show, are remarkably gifted men and genteel and warm and offbeat, and Arno Margolin and Jim Parker were the other team, and equally gifted. And there was a great deal of harmony and peace in our office and shared joy. And Milt Rosen would join Arnie Sultan and I in the rewrites. So we had a very first-rate group of writers. There were no compromises. Not necessarily true today. There's so many shows on the air that you hire writers just to have bodies. A Rock by Any Other Name was an exploration of a relationship. In our story, a husband and wife agree not to spend more than $10 for an anniversary gift. They had a very restricted budget. She took a rock that had great meaning to her. It was a rock that fell on the car the night Dick had proposed to her. And now she was determined to add a small key ring to it, and he would have a truly meaningful memento as his gift. He had bought her a fox fur coat, a short fox fur coat, and she opened his first and was elated with the gift and was excited, as any woman would be, with the coat. And then he opened his gift, and he said, "What is this?" And she said, "It's a rock." And he said, "How does it open?" She said, "It doesn't open." He couldn't believe that it was a rock. And before she could explain this, the sentimental meaning behind the rock, he had behaved poorly. He was felt she had disappointed him, and then she realized that he had violated the bargain. She'd kept within it, and he realized the truth of this. But by then, he had thrown the rock away. When she said, "Give me the rock, and I'll have the key ring attached to it," he threw it somewhere in Central Park, and he and his buddies went looking for that rock, and brought back a ton of rocks, none of which was the rock, which he knew so well. And ultimately, she and he, of course, got together, but he had learned something, and it further cemented their relationship.
And that was based on a true story?
Yes, which didn't turn out quite as well. The husband and wife upon whom it was based separated. He and She was not dissimilar in its recognition pattern to I'm Dickens, He's FENSTER. It won many awards. It affected the country newspapers. Local newspapers had full-page ads protesting the cancellation. Jerry Lewis, who we only knew slightly, took out ads in the trades. It was truly a beloved show, and I think it was in a horrendous time slot. It followed Green Acres, and there was no compatibility to those two. And what was even worse was the very last thing was a chicken laying an egg before they said, and stay tuned for he and she, if you remember the ending of Green Acres. So maybe that was a harbinger of things to come. Dick and Paula were nominated for Emmys, and Don Adams won for Get Smart, and we always felt Don should have won the previous year. So again, sometimes the Emmys catch up, and you are awarded for something you did in the past, except Don Knotts, who's awarded and awarded continuously. I've been asked quite often if I'm equally at home in comedy and drama, and if I am, how come? And I've asked myself the same question a number of times, and it's only in the last few years I've had an answer that satisfied me. I think that a joke is an encapsulated mystery. You have a beginning, which you establish the characters, and then you mislead, and then you surprise with the ending. And so it's just an extended form. And I've been working in it all my life. And as a consequence, McMillan and Wife came to me in a rather easy fashion. And remember, it was leavened with humor. The relationship was somewhat mischievous. And I've been a prodigious reader of mysteries. I was weaned on Conan Doyle and John Dickerson Carr and Agatha Christie, and so that I was respectful. I think that was the best plotting, was always in mysteries. Good mystery writers are superb storytellers. On McMillan, the pilot, I was, in addition to the writer and the executive producer, also the director. As a matter of fact, throughout most of my career, I've directed our pilots. It was on McMillan and Wife that I became understanding of the director's attitude towards a writer. When you're directing, you forget you wrote the script. It's almost a schizoid. You're a separate personality. And I found myself saying a number of times, what the hell did that schmuck do here? And I said, wait a moment, that's me. So I could see the hostility that a director feels when he's in a position where he can't solve it, and he's not capable of changing the words or restricted from doing it. And so that this anger toward the unseen individual who ultimately becomes the enemy. Now, writers always write against someone, seldom for. That's how you survive. Certainly a comedy writer, you write against them. They won't do this. They won't like this. Screw them. We're going to get it done. A great example of that, Mel Tolkien, who was a head writer on Sid Caesar, joined me on doing Dickens and FENSTER. My show, I was in charge, and we kept saying, they won't like us, they won't do this, they won't accept this. And Mel one day said, wait a minute, Leonard, they is us. And we said, oh God, what do we do? So we decided to write against Carl Reiner, who was next door, and Mel's old friend. And we got along very well. Carl won't like this, Carl won't do this, Carl won't. And one day Carl came in and said, how about lunch? And Med said, get the hell out of here. Snoop Sisters is a marvelous experience because I worked with Helen Hayes and Mildred Natwick, extraordinary women, consummate artists, and great fun. And you have the least trouble with the most gifted. That's been consistently true. I did a series with Dan Daly and Julie Summers. No problems. Great fun. And so, unfortunately, we were victimized in that show by the writer's strike. The writer's strike happened, and we had a staff set up, and they couldn't afford to not work or not be given some compensation until the strike ended. And the studio was unwilling to do that. And we lost all those gifted writers to Police Story, and we were never able to replace them, and the show suffered.
Did you ever face adversity from the network because of the age of the lead actresses?
None. It was non-existent. I think everybody was in awe of Miss Hayes. So it was a coup to have her. They put it on at the show on at a ridiculous time slot, 7:30 on Wednesdays. So I think it was sacrificed. Along with the Snoop Sisters, we did a show called Faraday and Company with Dan Daly, and we were part of a wheel, a Universal, a second wheel. And then we created the Snoop Sisters. Alan Shane, who was our then casting director, had this idea for the series, and Hugh Wheeler wrote the script, and I directed the pilot, and it was most rewarding to work with these two gifted artists. And I remember that when all the scenes weren't together, so when one was working, the other would always watch and stand by my elbow and say, "She's brilliant. I wish I could do that." How television series have changed today from what was. The good ones haven't, but there are more of the less than good, and there's been too much creative interference by people incapable of giving sound, logical advice. I did a compilation of actual network notes, a book called The Martian Wouldn't Say That. And when you read that book, you realize that the people who are in charge now are not dullards, but they're not visionaries, and they don't have, nor have they earned the right to get involved in the creative process. There are memos in that book like, is there any chance of improving the quality of writing without doing harm to the show? You get into that kind of a mentality. And as I think I indicated earlier, the reliance on numbers. We are doing an enormous disservice to quality by this mythology, which we believe in. But people believe in it because it keeps them from having responsibility for the decisions. And we don't have visceral people any longer, and we don't have visionaries. And what we have is, with ratings, a formularized guesswork. There's many years ago in Town Associates, we spent a great deal of money testing, and found it was flawed, meaningless, really meaningless. But if you surrender that, then what do you base the cost of a show on? How do you sell it? You can't. It used to be, we believe, we feel.
Your gut instinct.
Yeah, now you got these innocuous statistics, or malleable statistics, or meaningless statistics. Mark Twain said it best: statistics are lies. We have business people, and I always stress that they're well informed, but not creative in the artistic sense, and they rely too much on marketing research. I think there weren't any marketing researchers, departments, when we started. There's no need for them in my mind. But then again, I don't think today that with computers and internet and all, there's any need for agents. The guilds can handle the representation of their artists. I say this because agents have disproportionate power, and all of us find ourselves genuflecting and seeking the approval of people we don't respect. Something wrong with that system. I've been accused of seeking perfection in each of our shows. I don't look upon it as perfection, but I've heard recently when somebody says, "Where's Leonard?" they say, "Still re-editing, get smart." I believe that you set certain standards and then you must reach them. They may not be perfection, but no compromises. And fortunately, the people I've worked with share that. And I'm blessed with having worked with innately gifted writers. And Alan Burns, I'm thinking Mark Norman, Arnie Sultan, who was my companion in arms for many, many, many years. Arnie Rose and Sidney Zelenka, who was like a mentor to me. He was older than I was. Today he wouldn't be working, and I would have learned nothing. And he taught me so much. It's ludicrous what's happened with ageism. It's another form of madness. This has to be stopped. The Guild has to be more active. But the Guild itself has got a schizoid problem. If you bring back the old people, the young people may be put out of work. So how does the Guild handle this? When I first started, this is going to sound odd, I got most of my ideas from radio. That doesn't mean that I took the plots, but I learned from radio the cadence and rhythm of a joke. And then, because radio forced you to be a collaborator, you had to envision what the people were speaking looked like. You had to create the ambiance, the set. And so that, what a marvelous medium for a young person, what an enormous influence it had on the imagination. And I think if you look at my peers, all of us, no matter where we were in the country, were influenced by radio. Because it's odd that somebody from North Dakota could have the same joke construction as somebody from New York or somebody from California. But we listened to radio. When I did a script for George Burns' movie, he said to me, "You captured me perfectly." He said, "There's nothing I need to change." And I said, "Well, thank you, but I've been listening to you for 35, 40 years, and I know how you speak. I know your rhythm." Question often asked is, where do ideas come from? And in school, they will teach that you read the newspapers, you keep abreast of magazine articles, and there are stories to be told. I have found that almost everything I have done has come from some inner awareness of what I want to tell. If it were mysteries, I would, in the many Macmillans that I wrote, I would try and do something that hadn't been done before, that how could I mislead in a unique way? And I would challenge myself. So I must say that I can't consciously say I went anywhere, researched anything. I just went to what may be innate or may have been a gift that I didn't recognize. But very often we sat in story meetings. Steve Bochco was our story editor the last 3 years of McMillan and Wife, and we just sat there and talked story, pounded a premise until it fell into shape and could be a Macmillan. I'm opposed to those concepts that there are only 17 stories and you rewrite them. I don't know where that number came from, and I think it's rather meaningless. There should be, each of us should have a unique story to tell, and perhaps 100. It's for me difficult because as I said, 50% of what I've written was totally out of my imagination, and the others were remembrance of things past. As I have indicated earlier in the interview, some of the stories were based on things that happened to friends, generally stories that traveled through the family became viable, and I realized their potential. When we did a thing like Governor and JJ, we researched the political arena, read a number of novels just to see how characters reacted to that environment. But most of the stories were the result of the characters we created. If you create very distinctive characters, you're going to get different stories. We had a defiant daughter there who was apolitical, and didn't realize her responsibilities, that in a sense she represented a father. So it was a natural battle between a father and daughter in a time in the 60s, reflecting when younger people were disenchanted with government. In fact, the opening moment in He and She said all there is about the two characters. They came into the room, didn't say a word to each other. She sat down on a couch, and he crossed to the desk, slammed this briefcase down. She started to crack nuts in a bowl. He put some papers in the briefcase. He walked to the door, and he opened it, and he turned and said, "What do you mean we don't communicate?" And from then on, we had the premise for our series. Structure, to me, is telling a story, having a beginning, a middle, and an end, and in that order. It's been violated now, and I also feel that I think I'm going back to a French critic who said drama is a representation of the will of man in conflict, and that has worked for me because you struggle against your mortal enemies. You struggle against yourself, against history, against societal laws, mores. You have an obligation in that story to attract and hold the audience. What major chord in human nature do you play on? It's my belief that you play on an innate absorption with watching things being worked out, having other people resolve their problem. It's people seem to be most content to be witnesses to events. In a sense, it's a telepathic. Conflict is telepathic, a shared meaning. You think of watching war dramas, courtroom dramas, or if you take a domestic situation, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, or most recently American Beauty. You're the witness. You're not the participant, but you're involved. When I write a story, I don't think in terms of individual scenes. I think of the first doing the story in a narrative sense. I write it as if it were to be published as a book, a novel, a short story, a novella. Then I do a scene breakdown, and then I always approach the scenes the same way. I write every single thought I have about each of the characters down. Don't worry about continuity. Then I start to see how the character is developing from what I've written. Then I'll put them in some sequential order. I may drop 70% of what I have written, but I never have a scene in which the characters don't advance the story. If it fails to do that, I drop the scene, or I rewrite extensively what is being talked about. I think the obligation of each and every scene is it must advance the story, or it doesn't, or give you insight into the character that is important to the story, not tangential, but part of the story. In terms of camera action and blocking, as I became more and more proficient at directing, I wrote less and less descriptive passages. I pretty much eliminate all shots. I figure that is the director's prerogative. If there's something I need specifically in a scene, I will say that as simply as possible. Originally, when I wrote narrative, I wrote it funny. And then I found that the first few scripts I wrote, people said, gee, the film isn't as funny as the script. And that was true because the furniture was no longer funny. whereas I describe things like it's Louis the 16th. If you don't pay Louis by the 15th, it's gone on the 16th, you know, and things such as that, which don't show up on the screen. Dialogue has a vital function. First, each and every character must speak in their own distinctive voice, and then don't have them say anything if it doesn't advance the story. If it isn't telling you something you need to know. It may be something you need to know about them and not necessarily the story, but ultimately it will become a part of the storytelling process. When I work, wherever I am, I try to create the same ambiance, which is a feeling that is very much a part of my home life. I work in a book-laden room. I generally work at night, so I try and keep the room on artificial light, not sunlight. I still work with a manual typewriter. All the young people in our office come in and look at it. It's something they've never seen before. I worry about where would I get another to replace it. I don't like the computer, although I am familiar with it, because scrolling up and scrolling down, I can't see as much as I want to see of what I've just written. So I find on the computer, I am always printing everything, and suddenly there's paper everywhere, and I'm navigating the room to read what I've written. So I guess it's a Pavlovian conditioning. I'm at home with the typewriter. I often dictate into a tape recorder. That is a result of Arnie Sultan refusing to ride with me in the car. At that time, I used to write notes while I was driving. He bought me a tape recorder, and I overcame my dislike of my own voice, and I'm comfortable with it now. What does one do if one has writer's block? If you recognize it, you also realize that you are constantly working on the problem. So you can do anything you want. You never have left the work behind. It's with you. It's both the benefit and curse of being a writer. So I have learned that, oops, I'm in a writer's block. I make that announcement myself. I go somewhere, and as soon as I know I've forgotten something, recognize I'm close to the solution. All the avenues my mind travels down are now on one path toward the solution. If I were a young writer today, I would learn to be true to my own vision. Don't compromise it because you think it will sell. And the most important and most practical piece of advice is when you tell somebody about your screenplay, be sure to say it's brilliant. You may be quoted. Nobody will remember who said it,